So you can see here that I've finished my binding on both of my long edges, and I've still got bits of thread that are clinging on here on both of my edges, so both of those long curved edges. Now this is my lining, so this is what I want to have on the bottom. This is my exterior fabric, so this is what I want to have on the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of those wings and I'm going to fold it in at that point where it joins, and I'm just going to clip it in place at that end and at this end. And what you need to do is make sure that the edge of that wing, so this bit, matches perfectly with the edge of this sort of central square, if you like. So that matches perfectly. I'm now going to take the wing on the other side and I'm going to fold that in exactly the same way. Now these will overlap. Okay. And I'm just going to clip that in place. Now, if you're a person that's got a machine that doesn't do very big, bulky, thick seams, then you can run a zigzag right the way across this, because this is going to be a little bit bulky. So you can run a zigzag right the way across the edge of that seam, which will flatten it down a little bit for you. I don't usually do that, and I don't need to do that. As long as you go fairly slowly, you'll be fine. And you're going to stitch that seam across all of those layers using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So from one side, I go slowly. I have a size 16 universal needle in my machine because this is a little bit thicker. Okay, so I've gone all the way across. Now, if you're worried about the thickness, again, if you want to take out some of the bulk, you can do an extra couple of lines of stitching within that seam allowance, which will keep that bulk sort of nice and together, which actually will make your next stage easier. So I don't have a zigzag on my machine, so I'm just going to basically do a couple of lines of stitching just to flatten out the seam allowance there. I have a little tiny bit of fabric that's just kind of shifted itself there. So I hope you can see I've done about 3, in fact you probably see it better that side, about 3 or 4 lines of stitching just to flatten up that seam allowance out. And having done that, we're back to the binding. So I'm going to take my binding and with the open side towards the edge of my panel, I'm just going to fold over approximately 1/4 inch just to give myself a nice folded edge. And I'm going to take my binding and match it up with that corner. I'm probably about 1/8 of an inch past that corner, just because that makes it easier for me. And I'm going to put the binding all the way along this straight edge when I cut the other end, I'm going to make sure I give myself an extra 1/4 inch again, because I'm going to turn that in again to make that nice hem on the end. So I'm just going to take that 1/4 inch, fold it inwards, and again it sits about, you can just fiddle with that until it sits nicely. There we go. So it's popped all the way along that folded edge that you just made. And now I'm going to stitch that in place using, again, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is where you'll be grateful for the fact that you've flattened it all down, because it just gives it a much easier, it's much easier to fit the binding when you're not trying to fit it to something that's really bulky. Again, size, I haven't changed my needle, so size 16 universal needle. Okay, so now my binding is attached. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim off the corners of the binding within the seam allowance. So not this part, just a little bit that's within the seam allowance. I'm just going to make sure that, again, I've got another little tiny bit that just kind of needs to be nice and straight and smooth. And then we're going to do exactly the same as we did before, in so much as we're going to bring our binding over. Now, because this is thicker and it's got lots of layers, your binding will need to be given a really good pull to pull it over. And it's the layers that is the reason why we do that extra line of, extra couple of lines of stitching, because we need to just give ourselves enough binding to get over. Oop. So you need to just give it a bit of a wiggle and bring it over. Now this will need to be finished by hand, because you've got, why is that not wanting to go on there? Maybe I'm just not putting them on far enough. You will need to kind of manipulate it over and hold it in place. And this bit really does need finishing by hand. You're asking a lot of your machine if you're going to expect it to finish this bit off by hand, by machine, because you are going through quite a lot of layers, or you would be if you were using machine. So there we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself threading needle again. And I'm going to pop a knot on the end. Now, before I go along the long side, I'm just going to stitch this end of my binding closed. So I'm starting from the inside, so the knot on my thread will be inside the fold. I hope you can see that. And I'm just pushing the knot inside of the binding, and I'm just going to go through the sort of ends where we made that 1/4 inch fold. I'm just going across the ends. Now, as I said, we left it about 1/8 of an inch longer, and the reason we did that is because it allows us to kind of close that end up. needles come off. So having closed that end up, we're now going to carefully stitch down the other side of our binding. And because we've got a lot of layers here, it's possible that you may not have exactly the same amount of binding on this side as you have on the other side because of the thickness. In fact, I'd say it's impossible that you don't actually have that issue, which is why it's better to finish this by hand, because if you try and finish it by machine, you're going to have rows of stitching all over the place. So I'm holding this close to my body just because it's easier for me to do so. And I'm just giving it an extra tug as I do the stitching, just to make sure that it's all staying where I want it to be. And we're bringing it over and using that same either a slip stitch or an invisible stitch to just hold down the other side of your binding, again going through the fabrics and through the top of the foam. Really, you just need to kind of grab a little bit of the foam. Now you could in theory do these with fusible fleece if you wanted to, but I'm not sure how structured they would be. But if you really don't want to use foam, then perhaps fusible fleece is the way forwards. Now the one thing I will say is that you really do need to use a woven fusible interfacing. Do not use your generic non-woven that's 99p from eBay or off of Facebook Marketplace, because you really will not get a decent finish if you use that. It's well worth making the effort to use the correct interfacings. And I know that, say, quilters will say, oh, we don't use interfacing on quilts, and you don't. But this isn't a quilt. We're using quilting techniques to create something different, so hence we're mixing and matching bag making techniques and quilting techniques. And my needles come off my thread again. So I'm going to go all the way down to the end of my binding, attaching it on the inside. I'm making a pig's ear of this. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other side of my little tray, and I'll show you. I'll show you the video. I'll continue videoing until I get to the end of this bit of stitching. It's not going to take too long, and hopefully I can then show you the other side. Well, I won't show you the entire stitching, but we'll do the other side, and you'll get an idea of how this strange shape turns into a tray. I do love my clips, but sometimes they just get in the way. I've got a couple of thread ends there that are going to bug me, so I'm just going to remove them. And again, when we get to this other end, I just need to put one more stitch across there. Again, we're going to just stitch to close that gap up. So we're going to go through one side and through the other side. I just use the needle to push any stray threads back in. So just tiny stitches just to close that sort of end up. Once you've done your tiny stitches to close the end up, go back in and bring your needle out at the bottom, so near to the folds there. And this is where you can do your sort of couple of stitches to secure your stitching. Now, rather than just cutting that thread off, which you can do, but it's not ideal, I like to put my needle in and it'll go between the layers and come out. Oh, it's not a very long needle, so it's only going to be about an inch away. So my thread's now kind of coming out further up on my thread there, making sure you don't cut the fabric, and then if you just give it a bit of a scrape with your fingernail, you'll find that that hole completely disappears. Now, if I turn this in the other way, you can see that what we've got is the beginnings of a box, and you have this overlap side. Now I'm going to do the other side here in exactly the same way as we did just now. Make sure that when you do this, you can either do them so that they overlap in exactly the same way. So if I do mine like that, then mine will be overlapped in the same direction, or you can do them the other way so that they're overlapped in the opposite direction. Very much your choice. But I think I'm going to do mine opposites because I quite like that idea. So let's say, if you wanted to zigzag down just to flatten those seams out, you can zigzag before you start stitching, or you can zigzag after you've stitched, whichever you prefer. I just don't find I need to do it. Let's just trim off the extra bit of binding that I still have. where I hadn't cut that off as neatly as I could have done. And we're just going to do exactly the same thing again. So I'm going to do an extra couple of rows of stitching just to flatten that out. Then I'm going to bind it in exactly the same way as we did with this side here.